A New Kind of Church: Understanding Models of Ministry for the 21st Century by Aubrey Malphurs. Introduction. I took one look at Pastor Bill and knew something was seriously wrong. He had dark circles under his eyes, and they looked puffy, so I asked him how much sleep he was getting these days. He confided in me that he slept little, and it was beginning to tell on him. He also looked gaunt, and his wife was beginning to worry about him. What was his problem? Did he have some serious physical ailment, such as a heart trouble or maybe even cancer? No, what was happening to him was likely worse, depending on your perspective. Several months earlier, one of Pastor Bill's key staff persons resigned to pursue ministry elsewhere. When people asked about his resignation, the staff person confided that he didn't agree with the church's direction. The church could be called a seeker church, and included elements of the purpose-driven church model. The church's leadership didn't realize that some others in the church felt the same way as his staff person, but had remained silent. The staff person's leaving served as the catalyst for these disgruntled people to coalesce. As word got out about the resignation and the reason prompting it, this minority began to express itself in a number of ways. First, they talk among themselves, discussing the resignation, their empathy for the staff person, and their dissatisfaction with the church. Second, they began to show up at board meetings to verbalize their discontent. And third, several wrote letters, some very extensive and harsh, to the board as to why they believed the church was moving in the wrong direction. Bill and his staff just didn't sit back idly and watch all this take place. They went to countless meetings, both public and private, to explain themselves and what they were seeking to accomplish. At times they felt as if they were ministry firemen, spending much of their valuable time fighting fires rather than igniting fires for Christ in their community. Their efforts helped to some extent, but just about the time they thought that if they put out the fire, it would reignite, making matters even worse. What had been a dream job was turning out to be Bill's worst nightmare. Most good leaders have the same fatal flaw. They like to please people and keep them happy. And when people aren't happy and complain, leaders aren't happy. This was true of Pastor Bill. Furthermore, his church had been growing, due in large part to its outreach focus on Sunday morning and its evangelism ministries. Bill and the staff had worked hard, very hard at keeping the church focused on outreach, and the result was significant conversion growth. Now all was in jeopardy. In fact, Bill was in enough emotional pain that he was finding it increasingly difficult to resist thoughts of resignation that had recently begun to nag him. A familiar story. Chances are very good that you are familiar with such a situation as Bill's. Perhaps his story is your story. In some way, you can identify with this man and his church. It may be that you are a member of a church that has been through a similar experience. If not, it's likely that you'll know of a church somewhere close that has, and you're wondering what's going on. Or maybe you're part of a group in a church that is struggling with the church's current direction. The leaders are not doing church the way you think it should be done, and you ask, why is all this taking place? The 20th century as a whole was a time when we didn't see a great deal of change, at least nothing what we've seen toward the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Widespread change is also being reflected in America's churches. During most of the early to middle 20th century, there was a typical traditional way we did church, and a large number of people attended church, especially in the South. As we've transitioned into the 21st century, however, the number of church people has decreased considerably, and several new church models have been planted on American soil. In addition to address demands for change, some established churches have transitioned and adopted new ways of doing church. The problem is that, while they claim to be churches, they don't look like the church, at least not the traditional church model that was the norm during much of the 20th century. There are all kinds of labels for these new models, such as emerging churches, megachurches, seeker churches, purpose-driven churches, cell churches, connecting churches, contemporary churches, house churches, new paradigm churches, postmodern churches, and so on. For example, I'm aware of one church that seeks to combine what it believes is the best of the seeker church model with the purpose-driven church model. Church names don't sound familiar either. Some I've heard are Mars Hill, Journey, Crosswalk, The Highway Community, Warehouse, Next Wave, Solomon's Porch, Liquid Church, and Mosaic. What happened to a good old First Church downtown? I firmly believe that, quote, we ain't seen nothing yet. There's more, much more to come. New model churches. Some important questions are these new church models really churches? How can we know? Or are they some weird aberration or cult in church clothing? And worse, are they taking us down some slippery slope that will not only dilute the church's impact, but lead to its doctrinal heresy? Should we sing their praises or throw stones? Some people have opted for throwing stones, describing these churches and what they do in a derogatory emotional language. They might say these churches are, quote, taking their cues from the world, quote, slick, or just, quote, entertaining. However, if we can get beyond their offensive language, I believe we can learn from the critics of the New Paradigm churches as well as from churches themselves. The major issue we must address is wrapped up in the question, is there a standard model for doing church? Does the Bible give us a correct, prescribed model that we're all to follow? If so, is it more like today's traditional or contemporary format? If not, then each church is free to develop its own model. Are there any biblical guidelines for this? Why this book? There are several reasons I've written this book. First, it's grown out of my love for the local church. I believe that Bill Hybels is correct when he says that the church is the hope of the world. Jesus says in Matthew 16:18. Second, my love for Christ's church has led me to study the various church models, and I would like to share what I've found. Third, my experience as a consultant with churches where some infighting is taking place has raised my concern over what critics of the New Paradigm churches are saying. I worked with one church where the critics caused great harm to the church, its outreach, the pastoral staff, and the pastor in particular. It took a great, huge emotional toll. He, like Pastor Bill, didn't get much sleep at night. I took the opportunity to engage at least one of the church's detractors so that I could learn more about such critics and how they think. Some of what is in this book, especially Chapter 10, comes from that conversation as I've thought through what is being said and how it interacts with the Bible. A fourth reason for my writing this book, as I'll demonstrate in Chapter 1, is that the church is in a serious decline, perhaps unlike any time in America's past. Not only are vast numbers of people unchurched, but a number of Christians are dropping out of church, and many of these are spiritually vibrant people who feel that their church experience is doing them and their families more harm than good. I believe that the new model churches could offer a viable answer to this dilemma. Who should read this book? Every church is a model, whether it likes it or not. Church models are all about how we do church, and every church does church some way. So this book is for all church-going Christians. It will help lead pastors who are church planners and revitalizers, and their teams think through what they're doing as they wrestle with and develop their church models. Their people will have both questions about and objections to what they're doing, and they will need to provide their people with biblically based, carefully thought through answers. However, more specifically, this information is for the people who make up their congregations. It can help them understand what is happening. Consequently, this book is a must-read for those congregations that are going through church renewal or church planting. Every congregation is made up of several groups of people who relate to change and new models in different ways. The wise church, in general, and its leadership in particular, will take time to help these people understand the reasons their church does what it does. The following presents 4 congregational responses to change. As you read through them, determine which category best describes you. Number 1. The early adopters are people who are looking for change and are glad to see when it happens. Number 2. The middle adopters are slower to move towards change. They are often the majority in the church and tend to be cautious and slightly skeptical. They like to sit back and see what happens. However, given enough time, they adjust to and eventually embrace change. Number 3. The late adopters are highly change-resistant and are the last ones in a church to embrace change. Number 4. The never adopters refuse to adopt change and are most vocal about it. They represent only a minority in most churches, but make it enough noise so that people think they are a majority. Okay, now you know the categories. Which group did you most identify with? More important, what are the implications? For example, if you're a never adopter, why are you reading this book? Isn't your mind already made up? I sure hope not. Perhaps it will give you some insight into what is taking place in the church world early in the 21st century. All of these people ask and need answers for their questions about how to do church, and I've written this book to supply those answers for all four groups. I must confess that I don't hold out a lot of hope for the never adopters. My experience with them has been that they operate more on emotions than facts. Emotionally, their mind is already made up. My hope, if you're a never adopter, is that you give this book a chance and read it through. I encourage pastors and all who are leading ministries to give their people a copy of this book. It will save them countless hours of explaining what they're doing and why they're doing it, and hopefully protect them from a lot of grief over what they're doing. Finally, this book is for seminarians and others who are preparing for ministry. It is important for the future of their ministries that they think through the issues of this book so that they know why they're doing what they're doing and can at very least articulate the reasons they minister in the context of a particular model, whether it's traditional or contemporary. There will be occasions when they will need to defend their model, and now is the time to think it through. My perspective. While it is impossible to approach any topic from a neutral position, I will attempt to do so in this book. I have pastored 2 traditional churches and 1 church plant that was slightly more contemporary than traditional. Currently, I attend Lake Point Church, a contemporary church in Rockwall, Texas, that has recently added a traditional, classic worship service. Thus, I have interests in and respect both ways of doing church. I'm convinced that there is much to learn from both sides about doing church in the 21st century. Furthermore, you must understand that I live outside the life and context of your church. I don't attend your church, so I'm not wrapped up in its politics. While this book might describe your church to a T, I didn't write this book specifically about your church, nor do I have some proverbial axe to grind with a particular group in your church. Thus, I hope to address these issues from an objective position. It's not important whether I or anyone else is traditional or contemporary in our approach to doing church. What is important is what the Bible teaches or doesn't teach about these matters. My authority is the Bible. I'm classically trained as a theologian, thus I have attempted in this book to use Scripture and its biblical theology as a sieve or grid through which I pass what the new models are doing and saying about ministry, along with the response of their critics. I believe that both sides would agree with my approach, since a person's background, experience, and preference tend to color the approach he or she prefers to doing church. This book will attempt to focus more on what Scripture says, or doesn't say, about how we do church today and the future. It's interesting that what Scripture doesn't say has vast ramifications about how we do church, as you will see. Where you are going. Finally, I've divided this work into 2 parts. Part 1 addresses our changing times. The first chapter asks, who is changing? It explores the following answers: churches, the unchurched, and those in cults and religious groups. Chapter 2 supplies 5 answers to the question, why are churches changing? And Chapter 3 presents the basic arguments for why churches should not change. Part 2 seeks to provide the reader with the information that he or she needs to make wise decisions about new paradigm churches. It consists of several chapters. Chapter 4, Doing Church, presents a hermeneutic for interpreting the biblical passages on doing church. Chapter 5, The Changing Church, provides the reader with a biblical theology of change, seeking to answer the question, what does the Bible say about change? Chapter 6, The Connecting Church, provides a theology of culture and answers the questions, what does the Bible say about culture, and how should culture affect the church? And Chapter 7, Defining Church, provides a definition for the local church, which is necessary to answer the questions about legitimacy of church models. Chapter 8, The Serving Church, provides the reader with Jesus' and Paul's teaching on the church's need to serve and not be served. It closes with an example of such a modern-day church. Chapter 9, The Thinking Church, returns to the thoughts of Chapter 3 and interacts with the critics' arguments against new paradigm churches, applying the material in Chapters 4 through 7. Finally, Chapter 10, The Strategizing Church, comes from the point of view that God doesn't endorse any particular church model. It provides a process for developing new church models. End of introduction.